All right, I'd like to have everybody give one more round of applause to our amazing sponsors back here. They are the reason we can make this event happen. And now I'd like to bring up Jody Moore with Dia Moore, who has been instrumental in making sure that Industry Forum happens year after year. So thank you.
Thank you, Al. And speaking of whom, thank you very much. It's so much fun to see everybody tonight. Isn't it great to be back out in person again, really? Kind of pretty much all the time. It's such a nice feeling. So it's my honor to bring up the person who invited and will introduce our keynote speaker tonight. This person is a great Portland treasure. He inspires and drives excellence and is an integral part of our built community, a force who connects us to the wider world and who brings the wider world to Portland. And he is, of course, Donald J. Stastny, FAIA. And he's been busy, and really busy. He's recognized as a leading design competition manager in North America. Don has recently executed an international design competition for a Cold War memorial for the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago and Madison, Wisconsin. He organized a design planning competition for Sandpoint, Idaho, addressing the linkage between the community, the downtown, and the waterfront, basically restructuring the central part of a unique small city in the Idaho Panhandle. Don is currently conducting a design competition at Portland State University addressing placemaking that is in its final stage of the process, and I hear there's some very good submissions on that. All these competitions are managed with the professional assistance of a wonderful woman named Jennifer Manhard, who is here today, and has her own business, Communicate Design. Projects either complete or nearing completion in Washington, D.C. would include the World War I Memorial across the street from the White House, the National Native American Veterans Memorial at the National Museum of the American Indian, and Bridge Park, a project that ties the historic town of Anacostia to the evolving development of South Washington, D.C. So when you're in those places, please remember, so that design and that competition that created these places came right here out of Portland with Don Stastny. Locally, understanding the responsibility of an elder architect and statesman, Don serves on boards of directors for the Helprin Landscape Conservancy, the Oregon Military Museum, and the Museum at Warm Springs, a project designed by his firm, Stastny and Burke Architecture, 30 years ago. As a board member, he's an advocate and activist for revisioning the Keller Auditorium, the completion of the Oregon Military Museum with a small theater and a tracks and treads exhibit, and refreshing the exhibits and the building at the Museum at Warm Springs. Don continues his understanding of the importance of art and architecture education by establishing the Graduate Reading Room at the PSU College of Architecture with over 1,000 volumes collected over his professional career. Dan Quartier, I thought you would be interested in that, since you so much enjoy the history of our area here and of the codes, and here we are with 1,000 volumes collected at the Graduate Reading Room. Don was instrumental in forming the PSU She Who Watches Scholarship in honor of Lillian Pitt, a Warm Springs artist, for the benefit of Native American, Alaska Native, and Hawaiian Native students in art and architecture. Don continues his individual quest in creativity through his painting and bronze sculptures, and with an ongoing installation of his work at the Northwest by Northwest Gallery in Cannon Beach. Do stop in to see it, it's beautiful. And having just reached his 81st birthday, believe it or not, Don is approaching emeritus status in his profession. Tired, as he says, but not retired. He's still showing us the way. What the fuck? Oh, please help me welcome our leader, our mentor, our colleague, and our dear friend, Don Stastny. I couldn't resist.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. That's better. That's better. We're all here together. We're all in this together in one way or another. I have the opportunity and honor of introducing a friend of mine that we've collaborated on projects, I think, for almost 40 years, 30, 40 years. And the invitation to Maurice came at a time when the city really needs someone like Maurice here. We have gone through some bad times, and we are rebuilding one more time. And those of us that built the city the first time 40 years ago are looking for the new leadership that will come in and reposition the city of Portland in the position that it should be. Maurice has quite a background. When I first worked with Maurice, he was the executive director of the Design Arts program at the National Endowment of the Arts. Before that, he had been a city councilman in Charlottesville, Virginia, and eventually became mayor. Maybe he's ridden out of town on a rail, maybe, or not. No, I think he was very much part of that. And then he went on to become the planning director at the city of Detroit, Michigan. And he's going to show you some of that material tonight. And just more recently, he was planning director for the city of Chicago. Now, Maurice has looked at Portland for some time as kind of this shining light on the hill, that we do things here that other people only talk about. And I think that is the challenge that we would like to put before you tonight through Maurice's presentation. I'd like to introduce Maurice by reading a poem that I wrote during COVID. We all did things during COVID that we didn't have time to do at other times. And it's called Seeing the Wind. Seeing the Wind. We cannot see the wind, only what it does. It pushes the clouds, it drives the rain, or makes waves in the ocean. We can hear the wind as it whistles, as it speaks through the trees, a breeze, a cyclone, a tornado, or a stillness in its absence. We can feel the wind, soft on the skin or harsh in winter, vacant in summer heat, a force of many faces. The wind changes the landscape, sometimes small grains of sand, sometimes ripples in the water, sometimes haunting, reawakening fears, sometimes comforting recognition of befores. The wind has a voice. It delivers messages. It provides guidance. It evokes spirits from the great beyond, an invisible force shaping the world. Maybe one day, if we are diligent, respectful, and we evolve spiritually, we will experience the unknown. We will see the wind. I'd like to introduce to you Maurice Cox, hopefully our wind tonight. Maurice.
The wind beneath my sail. I love that. Thank you, Don. We'll keep this down here. And thank you, Jody, for this invitation to some of the folks who corralled me over the course of months Tony and Millie. Thank you all for your diligence in putting on a wonderful, wonderful forum. I am no stranger to Portland. This city has given a lot to me over the course of my career, and I'm delighted to be back. I think the last time I was here was in 2017. But you'll see just how much influence this city has had and will continue to have on me. I entitled the talk, The Heart and Soul of the City. And I've been reflecting a lot about what that means to me, but also how so much of what Portland has done and stood for over decades has influenced me. I remember back I was a new city councilor in the 90s, and Portland's urban growth boundary was an example of already a restraint and a sense of making cities sustainable. And I was a city councilor in the midst of a grassroots movement to annex the sprawling suburbs around Charlottesville, which is the gray geography in the middle. And I resisted it because I thought it was an excuse to sprawl. And what better way to urbanize a city than to have distinct boundaries? And so that example helped me to convince citizens of Charlottesville to reject the annexation, the reversion, and instead to build more densely. And over the course of many, many months of community discussion, Charlottesville decided to triple its urban density. And that has continued to this day, that conversation about density and the contribution it makes to quality of life. When I stepped down from being mayor, I was determined to be the smallest city in America with an urban light rail system. In fact, I brought, with the help of a foundation, 24 civic and elected leaders to Portland to talk about your system, to learn about your system. And I led a task force in Charlottesville. And this was a robust public conversation. They ended up building the density, but they didn't build the transit. But then I came back 2010, and there was an extraordinary conversation going on about how to cross the Columbia River and what that meant. And I remember very distinctly the kind of community conversation and battle to tame this piece of infrastructure. And I took away with me the lessons there. And when I was planning director in Detroit, the second international bridge across the Detroit River to Windsor was being conceived. And I remember fighting those battles to get pedestrian and bicycle access on this bridge, again, an international bridge. And it was because of the conversations I'd had and you had in your community about Columbia that gave me the inspiration. And I negotiated those. And the bridge is due to be open in 2025. An extraordinary achievement. Thank you, Portland. But I also remember back in 2013, and I was here in the Making Great Cities series. And I remember very specifically talking about the role of design in politics and how they're indivisible. And one of the young organizers of that conference was inspired by my story of becoming a mayor being a university professor and a city councilor. And then, I Google her, and she is mayor-elect of Oregon. An amazing achievement of an architect who understands the community that she's in, so much so that they elect her to lead. So I really, really look forward to seeing who's going to be the next mayor in the crowd here. You never know. I think the last time I was here is in 2017 at the Architecture Foundation of Oregon. And Portland had invented this concept of the 20-minute neighborhood, a fascinating way to meet the climate change goals. This whole idea of being able to walk within 20 minutes of your home to your daily conveniences really struck a chord with me. It reminded me of the neighborhood I grew up in. I exported it to Detroit. And I have to say, it caught on like a wildfire. Our mayor understood what we were talking about. And it became his mantra of rebuilding Detroit as a series of 20-minute neighborhoods. So as you can see, I watch very closely what Portland is doing and seek inspiration from it. But I also, that focus on the pedestrian life was something that was in Charlottesville's DNA. It was one of those towns that bricked over Main Street and made it a complete pedestrian space for about 12 blocks, and it's one of the most successful in the country. So this whole focus on pedestrian lifestyle, convening the public realm, was at the core of my belief system. But it also, there was a moment of tragedy that Charlottesville went through. I was no longer in Charlottesville when the alt-right gathered there to protest and killed one of the counter-protesters with a vehicle. And it was a very, very, very dark time for Charlottesville. And I will tell you, it's taken a very long time for that city to refine its voice, its civic voice. But I am, glad to know that they have persevered as communities can to reckon with the root causes of this and to do something about it. So I'm, inspired, and I also understand what Portland has gone through. I have tended to go to places that are really tough, and Detroit is one of them. Just in 2020, the situation of Detroit was so dire that it was the focus of national obsession that we were going to see an great American city die in our lifetime. And they said, actually, with the last person out, please turn off the lights. Oh, wait, it's too late. So this notion that cities can't rebound, aren't resilient, I soundly reject, and I would advise you to reject them as well. So I will say I finally got to a city that had a streetcar. I arrived in Detroit, and they had undertaken this queue line. And it was a way of rethinking a city that is basically been built around the automobile. I'm pretty sure they paid a visit to Portland when they were planning this. But it also talks about just being at the very heart of the city. And I think of the heart of the city as its downtown. It belongs to everyone. It's the social economic engine of our cities. And I could talk about the heart of Chicago, the heart of Detroit. I could talk about what it means to build investments in the public realm, new parks, new places. But I'm not going to do that. I could talk about the extraordinary moment that Detroit is having, where the second tallest building in the city is under construction. It's topped out. And some of the classic early high-rise buildings have been converted to hotels and housing. I could talk for hours about this work, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want to talk about the soul of the city. And the soul of a city resides in its neighborhoods. There are many, many, many souls. And if you don't tend to the soul of your city, then it will break your heart. And so I have spent a lot of time thinking about how you restore the soul of a city. And it's like not rocket science, it's straightforward. I think it's about the streets, both heart and soul, need these places, these public realms that inspire us. And when Detroit, just before the year 2000, this is what the heart of Detroit looked like. And over the course of 20 years, this is what has happened. It's become primarily a gathering space, one of the really premier public gathering spaces at Campus Martius. And that same place that was a vehicle roundabout is now a place where families and children can gather. So I've seen this happen, both in anticipating the kind of urban life that we want, like this plaza that used to be a parking lot that is still waiting for the urban edges to fill out. But so it's about these places, these plazas, these squares. It's about parks, parks that belong to everyone, parks that are our central park, placing the focus on the public realm where architecture defines the edges. It's also about greenways. It's about the connective tissue that connects one great place to another great place. And it's about holding on to the historic fabric that we have. It's about historic preservation. And not putting it under a glass and saying, you can't add or add to these historic assets, but to allow them to grow and allow new architecture to happen alongside it. It's also about development, but it's about development with character. This is where design really matters because it honors both the history of the place, it honors the people who live there, and should be excellent. But ultimately, it's about the people who have stayed in our cities, people who have returned to our cities, the people who love them and steward them. And so I spent a lot of time in Detroit trying to understand why, in the face of so much disinvestment and despair, 680,000 souls stayed. And I'm glad they did, because they elected an extraordinary mayor, Mayor Duggan, who hired me, was coming from an academic institution to be a planning director. And he said to me, my dream for Detroit is to see its population to grow again for the first time in his lifetime. And so that was our North Star. Could we take a city that has declined by hundreds of thousands over 70 years and have a strategy for it to grow again? So I took that on, and I placed design at the center of it as a value proposition for residents, not just for those who could afford it, but for everyone. So it involved extensive engagement, conversations about the city that we wanted, the neighborhoods that we wanted. And I must have held hundreds of meetings with people talking about their aspirations for their community. And I will say, America has never seen the level of depopulation of the city of Detroit. Over 7 decades, it lost 1.2 million people. And they often left their homes, their churches, their schools, all vacant. And it was a place that was scarred by demolition. But I had to look at it very, very differently, and I thought about it as a competitive advantage. This land was largely in public hands, and there was a sense of stewardship that I found in residents who would get on their power mower and mow the rest of the block. They felt invested in the landscape. But it was challenging because it's this speckled pattern that you see, a few houses on a block, some areas more populated than others. But I thought that if we could make residents an investor, an equity investor in that land, that we could do something extraordinary. So that's what I proposed, that we would identify the areas that were healthy, that had residential concentrations, and that we would start there with the landscape as a driver for the quality of life, and the existing homes as the anchors. And so over the course of months, we identified 10 areas, and we started with 3, and then we added another few each year, trying to understand what was the DNA of each of these areas. And, we tried a square mile framework, we tried a half mile framework, and then we ended up with the quarter square mile. That's a walkable distance. You could graft it onto a healthier neighborhood adjacent to it. It had enough vacant land that you could begin to experiment. And I built a team. I inherited 7 planners for a city of 680,000 people. And I was able to convince the mayor to allow me to hire 30 more planners, architects, landscape architects, historic preservationists. And here's the proposition we made, that we were going to create an urbanism from the landscape, and that the areas that you see in blue are the areas of vacancy. And we would use that blue to be the connective tissue to higher density areas that had their own kind of urban village in the middle of the city. You might argue a kind of growth boundary. And that the armature for this was going to be walking and biking, the idea of the 20-minute neighborhood, creating a life on the sidewalk. And we were going to bring some of the best talent nationally and internationally to work side by side with the professional planners. And we would create a process and that would create a framework for the reimagining of those neighborhoods. And this process usually was about 12 to 16 months with dozens of meetings and workshops for engagement. And at the core of each of this would be a quarter square mile strategy. So we wanted neighborhoods to be laboratories for reinvention of the city. And so I'm going to take you through 2 of these, but just to get a sample. One was based on homes and gardens, another on linear tree gardens, linear stormwater tree gardens. One was based on the missing middle density. Another was based on tree nurseries. And another in arts loop and greenway. So you get the idea. Each was both an architecture and landscape architecture proposition that could be walked. And in that quarter square mile, there was to be 4 strategies, constant. One would be a reimagined streetscape, a new public realm. The other would be commercial Main Street amenities and a neighborhood park. And then finally, the stabilization and rehab of vacant homes. And so Livernois McNichols was the first planning area, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference of what each needed. You see the red rectangle at the top was a main street, a historic main street that had fallen in disrepair. But to the east and the west of it, you had incredibly stable neighborhoods, University District and Bagley. But right there in that red square where you see all the blue was the weak spot, a place that had hundreds of vacant lots and about 100 vacant homes scattered amongst people who still remain. And so we coined this one the no-build option. Could we, with just the tools of vacant land, housing rehab, and an adjacent Main Street, recast this as a 20-minute neighborhood? And we created a fund that was both philanthropic, public, and private corporate dollars to have a fund to fund the improvements. And so the Fitzgerald plan, designed by Elizabeth Mossop and Wes Michael, was based on creating a central park out of vacant parcels assembled at the middle of the neighborhood, having a design agenda for every vacant lot in the neighborhood, flowering meadows or productive lots, and rehabbing 100 small homes, starter homes. And so these are affordable homes. We chose an emerging African-American developer to take on this challenge. And these homes would come with a vacant lot next door. And that vacant lot would be a flowering meadow would be planted. You're seeing one of them here. And the owner of that home would be able to develop it over a period of time. But the main purpose was that every lot gave you some joy, some visual pleasure. The other lots were to be productive lots. And so there's a great tradition of urban farming in Detroit. And so lots were repurposed for that use. But ultimately, the maintenance of these lots were going to be done by a green-collar workforce that all lived in that neighborhood. So you're seeing them clearing, planting, trained to be stewards of their own neighborhood, paid stewards. But it's also about parks. And how do you take this kind of hodgepodge residual land and form it into something that has a community identity? This is Ella Fitzgerald Park. It's an assembly of 27 lots. It takes about 2 acres in the heart of the neighborhood. And this was the vision of the landscape architect, taking on the streets, the alleys, as a part of the park DNA. And here you see when it was cleared, the proposal, and then as it was being constructed. And the idea was to, through some very subtle moves, to create a great lawn and to border it with a series of steps that were interpreted through a local artist through a tile mural frontage. And the community built this collectively as a way to have their fingerprints on the park and have ownership of it. And then the street became a part of the park language. This was an interpretation of an Ella Fitzgerald song, so that when you came over this, you knew you were in the vicinity of the park. And the recreational amenities, a full court basketball court, which was an anomaly for Detroit. They had taken all of these out because they didn't want gangs competing. So when these came back in, it was a clear signal that this park was for this community. And of course, a playful children's lot. But the main thing is that they saw the transformation of this neighborhood. They saw people coming to this park who had never come to this area. And there was a kind of mixing and calming and socialization that went on as a result of this. I also said it was about greenways, about the connective tissue between one area of the neighborhood to another. There's a major greenway going 27 miles, looping around Detroit, called the Joe Louis Greenway. But I was interested in the idea as well of what it means to connect within an established neighborhood, how you take these vacant lots and you can envision them as a kind of desire lines that go through a neighborhood, a typical neighborhood. So you can exercise, you can walk your dog. And so this loop that connects a half mile from one end to the next is now a kind of part of the infrastructure of that community. The other was, and a challenging part was trying to create a main street so that you could actually walk to locally serving amenities. The city didn't own any land here, and so through a third party, we were able to acquire 2 blocks of mostly vacant one-story buildings, and you see what they look like. And the idea was to have the coffee shop, to have the sit-down restaurant, to have this home base, which was a design center at the center of the block, which would be the place where you would convene meetings and have discussions and exhibit what was happening in your neighborhood. So we were able to take that block from the image you see on the right to the new businesses that are opening up at the lower part, and the first multifamily 3-story housing with retail on the base is under construction now. But I think the element that I am truly proud of was the connection to education. On one part of Fitzgerald was a college, Marygrove College, that was decommissioned. And through the Kresge Foundation, they decided to take on an experiment of 0 through 20. That 0 to 4 would happen on this site, K-12 would happen on the site, and 2 years of college. And so we commissioned Marlon Blackwell to design the Early Childhood Center. The school was repurposed as an elementary school, and the level of attention to design and the quality of this environment is such that it is driving people to move into the neighborhoods in its vicinity, and they can actually walk their kids to this center. So this tie-in between education and design and signaling to people the value that they have because of the design was a key part of the strategy. And about 75% of the kids who go here all live within a 2-mile radius. I want to talk a little bit about development, but development with character, specifically the Brush Park neighborhood and what it means to create a truly mixed income, a neighborhood adjacent to downtown. As I said, I had the good fortune that Detroit had already installed the light rail, But what it did is it instantaneously made every area adjacent to it a transit-oriented neighborhood. And so we took on the challenge of Brush Park, and specifically, how do you build a kind of typology, incremental development of a neighborhood that will grow over decades. And to do it, giving people that missing middle density, smaller high-rises up to 6 stories, townhouses, row houses, and so on, in an area where the city owned 60% of the land. And this is adjacent to downtown. You could walk to downtown from here. But that ownership allowed us to modulate the affordability of the area. And the pilot project that I selected was the project called City Modern, which was over about an 8.5 acre block and a half, one master developer, 5 different architects, and 5 different typologies. And it was going to be 30% affordable within this space. But I was interested in the way that you can create a code. So this is normally what our zoning codes look like. I was interested in changing that and making it a graphic code, a code that would explain to you what you could do with a single tear sheet and gave the streets their various densities, but also that the typologies of buildings would be determined within this, so that you got the code, and for years you should be able to design with great intention. And so about 600 units are now built. You can begin to see the various ways in which the densities present themselves. I was interested in this idea of buildings and neighborhoods built over time and how you could simulate that with contemporary architecture, as well as how you could juxtapose historic architecture and have the contemporary architecture be of value and of detail and of endurance and longevity. So these are townhomes. They're very expensive townhomes. But on the same lot, there are muses. And these muses are affordable houses. And we were interested in finding different ways to move through the block non-traditionally. So there's a greenway that passes through the center of the block. And then the alleys are the east and west. And so on the same parcel, someone is building a beautiful townhome, but someone else lives on that same lot, an entirely different income, living in proximity. And so this dialogue between old and new, contemporary, was part of the investigation, and how over time you can build with great intentionality this mixed income, architecturally mixed environment. And so this is the projection of about 1,750 units, each of them being done by a different development group, each of them having been the result of a release of an RFP from the city. And what's interesting is that you can change scenarios at any given time. You can correct for the market that may overreach, and it is driving up values. But then the city can release an RFP for an affordable housing project. And so you're starting to see the way developers are interpreting the form-based code. What was really interesting is what happened with this, which is an affordable housing project, the building in the center, the others are mixed. We started seeing a reorganization of the city block to allow for greenways to penetrate the block in non-traditional ways. And so you're seeing the first 2 buildings being done and these muses that are running north-south. But every building here is trying to honor the idea of design and design excellence, and diversity of typology and diversity of incomes. And so it's been fascinating to see. This is all of the projects you see here were commissioned after I left my role. So it's the form code and it's the typology code which is driving the excellence. So I want to talk about streets because these are really, really important to me. How do you take our love of streets and the public realm and apply that to your typical neighborhood? And this project on the Avenue of Fashion is one that we worked a long time to achieve. This is your typical street, sidewalk life, 8 feet. You can barely walk side by side. It was the center of this otherwise stable neighborhood. But 3/4 of it was dedicated to asphalt. It was a divided 4-lane, the central median, and the pedestrian was crammed up against the buildings that were 8 feet, sidewalks 8 feet. We wanted to turn that on its head and say, what if 2/3 of the public realm were dedicated to the pedestrian and 1/3 to the vehicle? And this project took dozens and dozens of community meetings to get people to appreciate what we were creating by turning the table here. And not only did we, discuss it, reach consensus, we also demonstrated it. We did a tactical intervention to show people what this would mean, and it stayed up for about 2 weeks. And it was fascinating to see the cyclists come out and the pedestrians come out. Well, once we had consensus to move forward with this project, and it actually became a construction project, well, all hell broke loose. And the protests started, and the construction was going on too long, and it was the typical disruption of construction. But we soldiered forward and gave people the resources they needed to weather it. And this restaurant, the one with the blue outline, the red outline, is Cuzzles. It's a well-regarded waffles and chicken restaurant. This is the environment before, and this is the environment after. 24-foot wide sidewalks, bicycles on the sidewalk, outdoor cafes, every mode of transportation you can imagine exists in this one photo. And needless to say, it has transformed this community. It is now probably the second most frequented main street in all of Detroit, and it rests 7 miles from the center of downtown in a community that is 98% African American. And so watching the civic life, community life flourish as a result of making space for it is really one of the things I'm most proud of. And not only, but it became the impetus for dozens and dozens of new businesses, locally owned, to open up. And so the lessons I took away from that is, do a pilot, test out the idea. Once you have a sense of how it's working, create a policy, and allow this to be the anchor, the guide for how you want to live. And so each of these areas now has a main street, and then go to scale. It has now become a $130 million streetscape initiative. and each one is different and tailored to that particular community. But it was so important that we had such a high bar and expectation because other communities saw it and they wanted the same. And so it's an important strategy, and it's changing these communities forever. But it's also about public squares and how you find places, gathering places within communities. And I'm going to talk about this small program that's a kind of post-COVID era initiative that we started. But it was about trying to find where the civic life, the soul of Chicago happened, which is on the streets and in the squares. And to do this, again, 6 miles from downtown. And you're seeing a Chicago Avenue as it passes through Austin. Our idea was to promote catalytic developments that would then spawn secondary activity around it, around the street, and to place them closely enough to each other that they could have a ripple effect. And so that red dot is a major mixed-use development. The dashed circle is this first tactical plaza. And this framework you're seeing is the equivalent of 5 acres, all of the smaller parcels together with community workshops. We imagined what they might be as a template, although we actually had the resources to do one. But then COVID happened, and this community was in dire need of places to gather. And this was a pretty hot spot in the neighborhood. You can see the buildings are largely, the retail are boarded up. There was so much drug activity here that the police put a trailer and parked their cars there. This was the kind of police response to keeping the community safe. And this was our response as designers. Creating a place that literally would pop as you pass through, and primarily as a canvas for the creative arts. So we imagined what it would be like to bring our local artists to create a defining mural. The architect created a pavement mural of sorts, and it would be populated with sculpture and art. Now, it may seem like a simple undertaking, but when I think about all of the folks it took to pull this off, you had the instigators, which were the commissioners, myself, the Commissioner of Transportation, allowing us to take over the street, the Commissioner of Arts and Culture, the community facilitators who guided this project, cared for the project, and the architect. And then the artists, 4 artists coming together to do this one mural. And the impact was significant. This was done with about $200,000, a lot of pro bono services in 6 months. 6 months. And we used it as a community build exercise, bringing families out to do the horizontal painting and creating a place of sheer joy where young people could be there with older people. You notice there's a police officer in the photo playing basketball. This is a different type of community policing. But the response was so joyous by residents, and the response from pedestrians and entrepreneurs who wanted to be near it allowed for it to start to have a ripple effect. So this one $200,000 investment spawned a new coffee shop and hub next door. So the community organizer became a design advocate and partnered with the same architect who did the plaza. The owner who would not participate in allowing us to put a mural on his wall, wanted a mural on his wall. And a 15-foot tall sculpture by a local artist is going to be placed at the corner of this. And the important thing is, and you can see the development that's coming just down the block, is that it started to give people a sense of how you use public space and value the act of gathering. So it anticipates that. And so the next project, which is being done by an African-American development joint venture, will restore this old bank building into a jazz museum and provide affordable housing and create another kind of cornerstone of this development. So, the lesson here was do a pilot and test these ideas out, and then create a policy. The mayor, she cut the ribbon on this, said, I want 10 more of these, and make it happen. So we used our COVID, our ARPA dollars, and gave out $500,000 grants to community partners with designers to create a series of outdoor plazas. There are 10 of them that are being developed. And so the point there is, once again, go to scale, do a pilot, create the policy, go to scale. And so this has changed people's notion about how public space should be used. And by the way, all of these have been executed within 6 months. So it's quick. The last part of this is the historic preservation. It's about historic preservation and how you address a place like Detroit that has thousands of vacant buildings. And we started to see a production of schools being converted to housing. And we followed them painstakingly, and they were very successful. They were also luxury housing. And this was a great concern to a lot of us, that the only way that the financials worked was to have them be out of reach of these communities. We also saw smaller efforts, more grassroots efforts, to turn this small church that was a witness to the uprisings in the 1960s into a coffee shop. A local entrepreneur gave them a grant, created this gathering place. We saw other developers taking on the different typologies, the everyday buildings of these communities, like this Chroma Innovation and Arts Center with a 9-story mural. And so these are big, resource-intensive undertakings, and they only get bigger in Detroit. The biggest is the Michigan Central Station, and this is how we found it. And having conversations with the mayor was, we have to do something to preserve the building until the right owner comes along. And I said, why don't we put in windows? He said, how many? Well, 1,000. And he convinced the owner of this to take this tactical approach to preserve the buildings, because we had many buildings like this. There was another, Lee Plaza Hotel. Here we were able to use a kind of heavy plexiglass to close the building to preserve it. It's now being converted into affordable senior housing. But what I found was that there were a lot of small initiatives going on throughout Detroit of friends of this and friends of that who found ways to protect these buildings. And you're seeing here the Algier Theater. And I said, well, what if we gave them a grant to take the boards off of the storefronts and to open them up again for pop-up retail, to redo the facade? What if we gave them a license to have a bar, a cafe on the roof, and get an elevator in there? And these type of tactical moves started to give us ideas for how you could begin to unpack the dozens and dozens of buildings that were too resource intensive to be completely converted, like the 42 vacant schools throughout Detroit. And so we created a program called SAVED, Schools Adapted for Vital Enterprise in Detroit. And the intention was to catalog all of these schools and come up with a development strategy and launch a website called After School Detroit. And on this site, every building has been cataloged, documents, multiple scenarios, and pro formas for their reuse. It was a massive undertaking, it took about a year and a half, but it changed the conversation about whether these buildings were blight or whether these buildings held the memories of a potential reuse. And we put things in context, the larger neighborhood around it, the development opportunity within that quarter square mile. But we also figured out what would it take to release a portion of that building asset and repurpose it so the location of the gym and the theater could be a self-contained piece while the rest of the building was put into a mothballed for another day. And so this strategy started to get people to think differently about the assets. And then every neighborhood framework plan we did had a school in it, and we packaged it for redevelopment. And every one found a development partner. So you're building the muscle and the belief that buildings should be reused again, to the point where we now have examples like this arts complex that's being done by two young 40-something developers into an arts precinct, an arts campus, working with designers who are trying to find different ways to repurpose single-family houses. So this expansive porch that wraps and unites these as a series of restaurants, which has just recently been completed. Just very novel, interesting ways of reusing existing fabric. And now the center church is an art gallery. But I would say the biggest challenge really remained the Michigan Central Station. This 14-story building with grand halls that used to be the Central Station and the vacant land that you see around it. And for this type of investment, you need a very big idea. And Ford, the president of Ford, Bill Ford Jr., convinced the company to purchase the Michigan Central Station and to use it as their innovation mobility hub and bring 5,000 jobs from the suburbs, from Dearborn, to be located in this building, at this building. And as you can try to imagine, 500 jobs landing in a neighborhood where the median household income is $20,000 a year, what that could mean. So our job and the muscle at this point was very well practiced. Our job was to create a framework, an equity framework around this investment, and begin to this scenario of the 20-minute neighborhood again. What if the highest percentage of people worked there would be able to walk from that area? And how do you do that? How do you create an intentional community that can be built over time? The lessons we learned from Brush Park then being our guide for how to create this new community. And the moment I think that Detroiters never thought would happen is being celebrated Monday after I leave here, going to Detroit to celebrate the reopening of Michigan Central Station as a mobility hub and center of the Corktown vision. And, this is my last image, but I also, if you follow news coming out of the Midwest, Mayor Duggan's dream of presiding over the growth of Detroit for the first time in his lifetime came true, where the US Census reported about 3 weeks ago that Detroit has grown for the first time in 70 years. And the places where they're growing are those places that I call the soul of the city, its neighborhoods. Thank you. So I was told that we might actually be able to take some questions. Right.
So we will take a few minutes, and if anybody has any questions, comments, whatever else that you want to accost Maurice with.
I'm curious how long you've been involved with Detroit, how long
Sure.
this whole endeavor has been, because
Wow.
it's like a tremendous amount of work.
Yeah. Well, Detroit, it hasn't been as long as you would think. Chrysler and General Motors filed for bankruptcy in 2009. Detroit filed for municipal bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Mayor Duggan was elected that year. I came in 2015. And so the work you're seeing was done between 2015 and 2019. And it has gone on unabated since. So what you're looking at is the results of 10 years. It's kind of amazing. But it was done with such care for those who were there. We had to plan as if no one else was coming. It was just for those souls who stayed. And we knew that if we built something that was of a high quality of life, that others would want to enjoy it as well. But when I think about this city, that in 2012 they said, we're the last people out, turn off the lights. And today you see this amazing resurgence. I think it's one of the most unlikely and extraordinary comebacks in American urban history, quite frankly. Yeah.
Thanks for a really inspiring presentation, Maurice. I'm going to try to encapsulate at least one small part of Portland's problem and get your opinion about it. We've had a lot of press about our downtown and its failings for many of the same reasons that other cities are sharing right now. But it's pretty severe and is largely economically due to the flight of businesses. Right. So downtown properties are going for about 30 cents on the dollar right now. Wow. Meantime, our neighborhoods, let's call it the sort of first generation neighborhoods, the pre-World War II neighborhoods are flourishing. They're all very, very healthy right now. Beyond that, there's an area east of the far east of Portland that was annexed in the early 90s. And it's really a hodgepodge of development. And that is where most minority populations and immigrant populations have been pushed out to. And so what it's created is this interesting dilemma of us versus them in many cases politically. So it's very hard to get the folks who are advocating for those neighborhoods in the outer part to be in any way, shape, or form advocates for the health of downtown. And I'm curious, in that encapsulation, obviously you're not here on the ground, how you would approach that. And how would you either make an argument for downtown or make an argument for both, or make an argument that really it's this newer sections of the city that need the investment first?
Yeah, no, it's the dilemma that so many cities struggle with, right? We've been told that the heart of the city is its downtown. It has to be vibrant. It belongs to everyone. Well, does it really belong to everyone? It doesn't have the largest residential population, and the population that lives there is because they can afford to live there. And so the vast majority of people live in our neighborhoods where the soul of the city is. And so you can't convince anyone that your downtown is more important than their neighborhood. So I have taken a both and strategy. We're going to work on downtown because it belongs to everyone. But we're going to work in your neighborhood because that's where the soul of the city resides. And so all the first neighborhoods that we worked on were miles and miles away from downtown. Purposefully, we wanted to show that you don't have to be downtown to have a great street or a public plaza or a main street or a great park. And that was the charge that was given, that we have to show residents that we care about where they live. So the community that you're talking about, that it has not received the attention, that's exactly where Portland needs to be. That's where the energy in this community should go. As you work on the downtown, the issues that you raised here, other cities are suffering the same, and I could have done a whole presentation on how Chicago has responded, because Chicago is downtown. We have an area that has a 30% vacancy at this point, and it's one of the storied streets of Chicago, LaSalle Street. And it was the financial district, beautiful early 20th century high rises. And we had to take that on. But how we did it was to solicit office to residential conversions. And the city would be willing to contribute to the renovation if 30% of the units were held to be affordable. We got 9 respondents. It was over 1,600 units of housing, which I'm talking about a street where there is 0 affordable housing on it. And it was the last big effort that we launched. Fortunately, the new mayor, Johnson, has picked it up. 5 of these buildings are being converted that will produce 1,000 units of housing, 330 of them affordable. So I don't think we could have made the argument, because it's coming at a very big price tag, about $150 million. If we had not been working in the 10 neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago, the furthest away you could be from downtown. And it's only because people have seen real evidence that neighborhoods are evolving and getting better, that there's a tolerance for that investment downtown. So that would be how I would approach it, both and.
Hi, Maurice. It's really awesome to hear your focus on historic preservation, and you've focused so much on the social aspect of it and the community aspect of it, and you've said pretty much nothing about the green aspect of it, and it seems like, especially when you think about European cities having buildings that are thousands of years old and still relevant
Sure.
to humanity. And so I just wondered if you might comment on that.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I take it for granted that people understand that the greenest building is the building that's already there to be reused. I had the good fortune of living in Italy for 10 years of my life as a practicing architect, where nothing is thrown away. Buildings are mothballed for decades until they find their reuse. And so I come with that built-in notion that the most sustainable building is the building that's already there. And I have, there's a reason that there's so much, maybe in part is because Detroit has such an enormous inventory of existing buildings. I brought that same culture to Chicago, and every project is generally a new building next to a renovated older building. And some of the developers are doing amazing things in terms of energy efficiency and other sustainable practices in their buildings. So I think that's the resource that we're given, and we are just kind of stewards of it. And it was really, really, really tough in Detroit because blight buildings had been left to such disrepair that most people just wanted them gone. And we had to build examples of how they could be reused in order to give people the patience. And I will tell you, tens of thousands of buildings were beyond, and the blight was removed, and that was one of the mayor's commitments to people. But tens of thousands were saved and rehabbed, even the modest homes, as you saw in Fitzgerald. So I am a preservationist at heart, and I remember once I asserted that Detroit doesn't need to build a single new building. We have so much inventory to reuse. The strategy was trying to find a way to have patience to wait for the right use to come, and strategies like the tactical preservation were born out of that way of trying to make something happen now so that people have the patience to wait for the future.
Good evening. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. You mentioned the 20-minute neighborhood, and at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned light rail and a reference to Portland and our light rail system. And I couldn't help but think about the ways in which I get around a city, particularly this city. And I'm curious if the advent of things like ride sharing had an impact on your approach to urban design and urban planning. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it was. It's interesting because Detroit at various times had an opportunity to build a rail system, and every time the auto industry made sure it didn't happen. So they never. I mean, I've seen so many plans. So we had to try to figure out how do you build a mobility city and in the motor city. How do you get people on bikes? And the street systems are such that every street could have protected bike lanes, and you would never know you lost any space from vehicular travel. And in fact, we did it. Within a very short order, we had accomplished more protected bike lanes as a part of the infrastructure of streets that were being built, as well as this 27-mile loop, the Joe Louis Greenway, which is already open in certain sections. So it was both integrating a choice and within the infrastructure, knowing that it's kind of permanent, and the time it will build out. It's the great thing about these pieces of transportation infrastructure is that they're there. Portland's streetcar system will be here decades to come. And so the things that it does will continue to happen beyond. But when you don't have that, so in Detroit, only people of low income ride the bus. And so our challenge was not how to get people, more people on the bus, but how to accept the ways that people travel. And so one of the auto industry folks, I think it was General Motors, bought a lion's share of Lyft. And so we started to have trunk lines on the radial streets, and the first mile, last mile was coordinated with a Lyft ride when you got off of the bus to get to your destination. So there were some really innovative ways of trying to think about how to work with this kind of mixed mobility that were a product of the limitations of a city like Detroit. But the other part, which was really key, was getting the amenities that people needed to be within a walk from their home. I lived in Lafayette Park, a neighborhood adjacent to downtown. I could get to the riverfront by the DeQuinter Cut, a greenway, in 10 minutes. Today, I can walk to a grocery store as well as walk downtown. So if all of those amenities are within that general area, you change people's necessity for the automobile, at least for their weekly errands. So it's not so much of, each city has to work within its kind of limits. And so the light rail, if we can get every one of those communities to become transit-oriented development along that core, that again will get people to consolidate and aggregate and cluster around transit. I will end to just saying, Chicago is blessed with an extraordinary transit system that we work very, very, very closely to create TODs, transit-oriented development, along those rails on the west side and the south side where people of color live. And it was amazing to see a whole generation of transit-oriented development, and none of it was happening on vacant lots adjacent to rail on the south and west side. We changed that. And now you see 10-story buildings, affordable housing going on next to rail. And it's an amazing story, just again, getting to that policy and why isn't it working and producing the results that you want, and then changing it, and then taking it to scale. Thank you for that. Thank you all.
Get off that easy.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone. Maurice, we have a tradition here at the Industry Forum that you are now part of the family.
Ha!
And
I love it.
Part of that family
Oh, wow.
is being blanketed in the tradition
Oh, love this.
of our Native American people
Wow.
over here.
Beautiful.
This is a shared, I think it's Shared Spirits is the name of it.
Love it.
And it works
Do
very
I
well.
get to do this? I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you all so much. Wow. Lots of ideas and wonderful presentation here tonight with Maurice and all of you wonderful 5x10s. Thank you so much. A lot to think about, and kind of gives us a sense of hope too. That there really are people thinking about these things and making change, that we can all have better lives and beautiful communities. So thank you all for being here very much. Take care.